I want to start off by thanking the Irish Deaf Research Network for the opportunity to present today. I begin with one of the most well-known images of an Irish workhouse, depicting the entrance gates at the height of the Irish famine. To me, this represents what most Irish people immediately envisage when they think of a workhouse. But it also represents a particular time in a particular situated context, in this case, 1840s Ireland, at a time of hunger, death and despair. Such images can lead us to conclusions that are misleading about the totality and overall nature of this institution around the country over the 80 years it was in existence. And assumptions about deaf people's experiences in workhouses can be similarly misleading. So this is what I'll be focusing on in my presentation. There is a historiography from the UK and Ireland on the financial and structural relationships between boards of guardians and the deaf schools. This is also a focus within my PhD work, but for my presentation today, I want to talk more specifically about the experiences of deaf paupers who spent time in the workhouses. Before we begin, we must be conscious that the workhouse system and the nature of poor relief, as begun in 1838, did not remain static. Workhouse functions, the composition of their population, how long paupers stayed there, the reasons why they entered, all these things shifted and developed over the decades, and this affects our study of deaf paupers. We must also bear in mind that the system saw, in practice, a lot of decentralization, with each local board exercising a great deal of autonomy and often clashing with the central government body, the Poor Law Commissioners or the local government board that oversaw the system. And this enabled regional differences to evolve in how the poor laws were administered. So here are some basic facts about the workhouse system. The core tenet of the system was less eligibility. This idea intended that conditions in the workhouse would be comparatively worse than conditions for any paid work outside, to dissuade people from entering and persuade them to seek employment. And we must hold on to this fact. Workhouses did not scoop up all manner of people just for the sake of incarceration. For one thing, this would be far too expensive. The Poor Law Guardians were an elected body. The workhouses were funded by a public local tax, the poor rate. And so guardians wanted to economise wherever possible, to be less of a burden on the local ratepayers, and so get re-elected. However, the Great Famine severely tested this entire system to breaking point. There were massive mortality rates and overcrowding in the workhouses. However, after the famine, numbers entering the workhouses dropped and became far more manageable, and the institution changed and evolved going forward. So how did the workhouses change? Well, post-famine, we see workhouse populations with much higher proportions of the elderly, the sick, and people with disabilities, including deaf people. There was also a large proportion of admissions of so-called casuals, who were homeless and who just sought shelter for the night. Also, boards of guardians, through legislation passed, began to take on more of a role in public health. They established a medical dispensary system, local infirmaries, and workhouse hospitals that eventually would become free for poor people to use. There is a quite limited historiography on the experience of deaf people in workhouses. Very few of the authors that do write about the topic use primary sources. As a result, there are some myths that I see being expressed or assumed about this topic that I feel are necessary to challenge. For example, the myth that deaf people were sent to or committed or forced to be in workhouses. However, this isn't the case at all. Put simply, nobody was sent to a workhouse in Ireland. In order to be admitted to the workhouse, you had to apply. The Board of Guardians would quiz you in what was almost like an interview, and people were often turned away. Once you were admitted to the workhouse, if you gave the authorities 3 hours' notice, you could leave again. So even this represents a harshness. Painting all Victorian institutions with the same brush of oppressive Foucauldian discipline can sometimes obscure, rather than illuminate, the richness that workhouse records can represent for the historian. These factors challenge notions of the workhouse as being yet another type of coercive total institution, such as prisons or mental hospitals. Another myth, that deaf people were in workhouses just because they were deaf. This is sometimes assumed and even stated in deaf historiography, but it has no basis in fact. Deaf people, like hearing people, entered the workhouse themselves for a wide variety of reasons, including those that are shown here. Here we see an 1847 legal provision which specifically allowed for people with disabilities, including deaf people, the elderly, and other groups, to receive outdoor relief in the form of money or food rather than having to come into the workhouse. So, given this, I argue that being aware of this historical context makes the study of deaf paupers in fact more interesting, bringing deaf lives to the surface in a broader sense as we explore their agency in entering, negotiating, surviving within and leaving the workhouse. However, it must still be said that none of this is to take away from the fact that some deaf paupers, left with no position, employment, family or institutional support outside the workhouse, could remain within, sometimes for decades, as we shall see. The actual numbers of so-called deaf and dumb paupers in workhouses were always rather small. But what is interesting to look at is how many deaf people were in workhouses out of the entire deaf population of Ireland as a whole, and compare this to the proportion of the general population that were in workhouses. As we can see here from these early census figures, a far greater percentage of the deaf population were in workhouses compared to the population in general. You can see the deaf percentage here in red. And in fact, as you can see, in these early years, this became more and not less pronounced. Early campaigners for deaf education would often point out the number of uneducated deaf people who ended up in the workhouses. They stated clearly that giving deaf children education would equip them with the skills to enable them to support themselves, and thus, in future, prevent them from having to enter the workhouse and being a burden on the rates, which was a phrase that was used quite often. As the number of deaf schools and educated deaf people rose, we might expect then to see the proportion of educated deaf people in the workhouse remaining low, and that deaf people who were in the workhouse would mostly be uneducated. But as we can see, the percentage of educated deaf workhouse inmates increased in this early period. This may partially have been a side effect of the numbers of deaf people who received an education, but it does show that simply receiving an education was not a guarantee for a deaf person that they would not at some point need the workhouse. As we can see from these figures extracted from the 1901 online census of Ireland, the proportion had in actual fact increased by 1901 to almost 50% of the deaf inmates of the workhouse. Put simply, by 1901, a deaf person in the workhouse was almost as likely to have gone to school as not. However, we should remember the changing function of the workhouse through this period. By this time, 1901, a major function of the workhouse was to provide free hospital and medical care. In fact, of the 103 deaf inmates identified in the 1901 census in workhouses, 1/3 of them, 33, were actually in the workhouse hospitals. Therefore, they were not necessarily inmates of the workhouse because of dire poverty or homelessness. One pattern that we certainly do see is deaf people who spent many years in a workhouse and often died there. You can see an example from Ireland here. It is worth mentioning that this was not simply the case in Ireland. An 1861 parliamentary report looked at paupers who had been in English and Welsh workhouses for over 5 years. The report lists details of over 230 deaf inmates, with one woman, whose name was Martha Tonks, having spent 55 years in the Bermondsey workhouse. However, there are other distinct patterns of admission to be seen. Among them, deaf people who entered the workhouse for a short time, but repeatedly, and sometimes over many years. Here is one example. Here we have another example. This time, the admissions take place over a period of 35 years. In Bessie's story, we see how the deaf experience of the workhouse could also be strongly gendered. And I have located several deaf women who had children in workhouses while unmarried. We can talk briefly also about how the poor law's effects on deaf people were regional in nature. The work of historians such as Alwyn Purdue and Mel Cousins, among others, has looked at how poor relief and workhouse care in Ireland could differ from region to region. If we look here at this graph, admissions to St. Mary's and St. Joseph's in Cabra's first 30 or so years, and how many pupils' fees were paid by boards of guardians, we can see a regional dimension. This graph illustrates how generous the guardians were in unions by each province in paying for deaf Catholic children to go to Cabra. And as we can see, Ulster guardians were markedly less generous in this aspect of relief. So these are some of the primary sources I'm examining. But one major concern is identifying the population or community or cultural group that we want to study within these sources. Obviously, we're all familiar with the cultural model, the capital D deaf community, that Deaf Studies takes as its primary focus of inquiry. At a basic level, it is the members of this group in the mid-19th to early 20th century that we want to look at. But does an Irish deaf capital D community exist in this period? Remember, Until the turn of the century, according to the Irish Census, most so-called deaf and dumb people were uneducated and would not have shared a common deaf schooling experience. What of the nature of Ireland as an overwhelmingly rural country? Can we assume a deaf community existed anywhere outside Dublin or Belfast or perhaps Cork and Limerick in such a rural nation where the numbers simply did not exist to support it? This leads to difficulties. Who is it that we are looking for? This has led me to propose a very rough, inelegant description of the individuals that I want to look at, which we can see here. However, in practice, matching this with the way labels and descriptions and terminology for such people, how these are used in the period we're looking at, becomes complex. When we look at the primary sources, the terms used in this period of Irish history to describe members of our target group can pose problems. And also, please note that these terms are often considered extremely offensive today, which adds another layer of complexity to these discussions. Let's look at the terms in turn. Deaf and dumb. This term was of course widespread and commonly understood, but it did not necessarily refer to signing ability. The phrase deaf-mute was used in a similar way as deaf and dumb, and there are some indications that it was preferred by deaf people themselves rather than deaf and dumb, and Graham O'Shea mentions this in his work. The word dummy was a frequently used colloquial shorthand in Ireland for deaf and dumb, though it was often also used in official records well into the late 20th century, especially outside Dublin and Ulster. However, there are indications that this word did not refer exclusively to deaf and dumb people, but also, on occasion, people who could not speak but could hear. The word dumb on its own is a complex term. It did not always mean dumb only. It often referred to people who were deaf and dumb. In my research, I find it so commonly used to refer to my target group members that any individual that I find described as simply dumb, I include in my study, unless I find other information specifically mentioning that they are able also to hear. And finally, the word deaf. We see people often being described simply as deaf in the sources. However, upon further investigation, this will almost never match our own conception of a capital D culturally deaf person. Almost always, someone described as deaf in this period will indicate a hard of hearing or late deafened individual. Ironically enough, this is the one category we could safely exclude from consideration if we only wanted to look at users of a sign language. However, exceptions always remain. What complicates matters even further is how individual deaf workhouse inmates, or prisoners, or patients were described over time and across different institutions in wildly different ways, covering all the labels we have discussed and others. Someone written down as a so-called deaf and dumb person in the 1901 census could be described simply as dumb in the 1911 census, for example. In fact, even if we wanted to rely on a unifying feature, such as a common deaf school experience, there is still variance and complexity. Let us take the 1911 census and St. Mary's School for the Deaf in Dublin, for example. Most child and adult pupils in St. Mary's on the 1911 census return were described as deaf and dumb. However, there were also numbers of pupils that could hear and could speak also listed. Anneliese Kusters, Di O'Brien and Marcia de Mulder raised the possible anachronism of deaf, capital D, deaf, used as a label when looking at deaf history. They propose a more inclusive use, generally speaking in deaf studies, of small d deaf to describe physical characteristics, and then adding elements to this base term, such as the phrase deaf signers. Use of techniques like this may offer a way to describe my target group that is as inclusive as it needs to be. It is still complicated, however, by the fact that the sources used typically are vague about whether a person is or is not a signer and what form of sign language they use. Let's now see an example of this varying use of labels and descriptions, and what it might tell us about how deaf people were conceptualized. Here we have some details about a Cork deaf pauper named John Reilly, and I'm indebted to Graham O'Shea for his assistance with this data. Let's have a closer look at what the indoor relief registers for the Kinsale Workhouse actually record about John Reilly. In the Kinsale indoor relief registers for the Workhouse, John Reilly's deafness and ability to speak is recorded in different ways. In the register books, there are two different columns used to record this information. One of the columns is for disability of the paupers. The other column is for more general observations. Many entries for John Reilly did not mention his deafness or ability to speak at all. We can be reasonably sure that these entries are for the same individual. We have matching age, matching address, and so on. But his deafness and his ability to speak or inability is not recorded consistently. As we can see, a total of about 25% of entries for John mention his deafness or his inability to speak, and they mention this in the disabilities column of the register books. But we can also see a larger proportion, 38% of entries for John, recording him with the label able for able-bodied. 24% of entries for John mention able, but also mentioning his deafness too, in the observations column. So clearly, John Reilly, a deaf signing pauper, is viewed, described, conceptualized, and recorded by workhouse clerks in a number of different ways over the years. Significantly, he's often categorized as able-bodied, while happening to be a non-speaking, signing person. Now perhaps clerks were overworked or felt the information unnecessary to record each time, but I still find this inconsistency interesting. It points to the possibility that deaf signing paupers were somewhat of an in-between category for the poor law authorities. Not quite disabled enough to not be able-bodied, and certainly to be described in this case as a dummy, but not disabled in the sense that poor law authorities might have formally defined it at this time. That deaf inmates may not have been viewed as fully disabled, and often sometimes as able-bodied, is somewhat borne out by the fact that deaf inmates in workhouses were sometimes given unofficial jobs around the house. Quite often, they would be placed in charge of inmates with intellectual disabilities, for example. deaf women are also mentioned as being nursing assistants, although towards the end of the 19th century, workhouses moved away from using non-trained medical staff. Board of Guardians newspaper reports quite often will mention the praise that some guardians have for deaf inmates, and praise them for their usefulness. However, in the same breath, guardians could also make fun of them. Cases of deaf paupers being given menial work that others would not do can also be found. A major theme coming out of my research into this topic is perhaps quite obviously communication. We see deaf applicants to the workhouse write notes to the guardians, as well as signing and gesturing, in order to be admitted. We also read accounts of disciplinary hearings, where deaf paupers with no interpreter or unable to read or write could not plead their case. We see glimpses into what workhouse medical care was like for deaf inmates when communication was hampered. One exciting aspect of newspaper coverage is that letters and notes from deaf paupers to boards of guardians or the local government board are often read out at meetings and printed in newspapers in full. This gives us a window not just into literacy levels, but into the voices and experiences of deaf paupers themselves. While there is little indication that deaf inmates were more violent than their hearing counterparts, we do see examples of rule breaking and violent behaviour, often punished by the workhouse master by withholding food or placing them in a cell for up to 24 hours. More serious infractions could lead to a court hearing and a prison sentence. However, in cases such as these, we very rarely find out the deaf inmates' side of the story, and it seems very infrequently that they were able to communicate it anyway. Intellectual disability and mental health issues arise quite often in the sources. Deaf inmates were often placed in the so-called idiot wards of the workhouse, and sometimes behaved violently towards inmates and staff. They could be committed to the local lunatic asylum, but would often be sent back as not insane. This was a common occurrence, shunting of problematic deaf individuals from institution to institution, including deaf schools, prisons, asylums, but more often than not, back to the workhouse again as a fallback solution. Alwyn Purdue has pointed out that women with illegitimate children, or who had got pregnant outside of marriage, could use the workhouse as a place of refuge. And as we have seen with Bessie Beers, deaf women could also take advantage of this. But other gendered aspects of the workhouse experience placed deaf female paupers in a uniquely vulnerable position. Many cases can be found where they became pregnant while inmates of the institution, with accusations from other inmates, or themselves made through sign or gesture, that a workhouse staff member, such as the master, the school teacher, the porter, etc., was the father. This could be highly scandalous to the local community and sometimes warranted an investigation by the poor law authorities. But ultimately, in most cases, evidence from deaf women in these inquiries was either impossible to obtain due to illiteracy or lack of an interpreter, or their evidence was not accepted as valid by poor law inspectors. Thank you.